Today I'm going to discuss the representations of Greenlanders in German language travel books published between 1933 and 1939 until the war. However, National Socialism is neither a literary movement or neither a distinct literary period or neither a literary genre, yet I still label it National Socialist travel literature. 1930s travel literature writing may function as a propaganda device in Nazi Germany, serving National Socialist ideology. The propagandist purpose of travel literature obviously narrows and distorts the author's vision of Greenland. When we talk about stereotyped representations of the Greenlanders in National Socialist travel literature, we must question how these representations emerge, how they are maybe distinct from Scandinavian representations, and how they serve the ideology of the so-called Third Reich. Well, first of all, I'm going to present German expeditions to Greenland. Not all of them have been conducted during National Socialism, but all the travel literature has been published during National Socialism. Second of all, I'm going to confront you with quite bizarre theory, the cradle of the human race at the North Pole. Sounds bizarre, but a lot of people believed in it. Well, then I'm going to talk about the superiority of the nature hero over the modern man. And last but not least, a Nietzschean approach to the topic, the Arctic Übermensch. Well, with 5 Greenland expeditions within a decade, Germany proved to be strongly engaged in polar research during the 1930s. The highlighted expeditions were led under German expeditioners. However, Austrian and German researchers also joined international Greenland expeditions, such as the 7th Thule Expedition with Knud Rasmussen in 1933 and the Oxford University Greenland Expedition in 1938. However, Greenland was not only a scientific playground, but also a destination of journalists, artists, cinematographers, and the like. Well, you see, 1 decade and 10 expeditions. It's actually immense increase in German polar activities. But why are there so many expeditions in the 1930s? First of all, the steadily expanding link between science and the state and the gradual absorption of scientific exploration and the political aims of the Nazi regime. That's an important point. Second, the shooting of feature films such as the universal film SOS Iceberg, you might have heard of it, it's starring Leni Riefenstahl, and the shooting of Rasmussen's semi-feature film Paulus Brühlfer in 1933. While German and Austrian cinematographers and actors were especially welcomed as participants of film expeditions due to their experience in the Alpine mountain film, in German we say Bergfilm. Third, the onset of tourism or some kind of proto-tourism to Greenland should not be underestimated, given that 2 travel narratives have been published by travel journalists and travel photographers. And last not least, Knud Rasmussen. Knowing Knud Rasmussen could tip the scale in favor of the realization of an expedition. And actually a lot of German scientists apparently knew Knud Rasmussen had good connections. The propagandistic value of especially popular scientific travel books was enormous during the 1930s. The travel reports should provide understanding for the Arctic research programs conducted by Germans, commissioned by the state, and make the readers familiar with the achievements, the big achievements of German polar researchers in the 1930s. Furthermore, travelogues reflected the very masculine ideal of the National Socialist Arctic researchers, who were expected to risk their own life for the good of the state. German researchers depicted themselves as soldiers fighting the Arctic front lines, even though all of the German expeditions were conducted in a rather mild Greenlandic summer. Alfred Wegener, above all, Alfred Wegener was idealized the prototype of the self-sacrificing researcher and the social-like comrade in Nazi Germany. In numerous travel accounts, Arctic researchers refer to the heroic death and the leadership qualities often referred to as Führerqualitäten of Wegener, who perished on the Greenlandic ice sheet in 1930. While in Germany, Wegener was often called a modern scientific Viking and became a national hero, just like Fridtjof Nansen in Norway or Knud Rasmussen in Denmark. But he became very late a hero. He was not that known as a polar expeditioner in Germany before his death. German scientists increasingly portrayed polar research as a political and a scientific struggle fight against other nations. German polar explorers emphasized that nations compete against each other in the harsh nature of Greenland and claimed that the scientific results first and foremost belong to their own nation. Scientific collaborations in the Arctic with other nations were not in the interest of the National Socialist regime. The last Arctic cooperation finished in 1932-33 during the Second International Polar Year with the Soviets. The Germans did not want to prolong this expedition. The militaristic attitudes of the authors are reflected in book titles such as Kampf in Schnee und Eis, Struggle in Snow and Ice by Leni Riefenstahl, Der weiße Tod, The White Death by Ernst Sorge, or White Struggle, Weißer Kampf by Paul Burkhardt. Well, it might be worthwhile to consider that all these expeditions were conducted in summer. Well, I will skip the Wegener expedition and start with the maybe not so known expeditions. I would like to begin with the Universal Dr. Funk expedition, which was conducted in 1932 in order to shoot the Universal movies SOS Iceberg and North Pole Ahoy in West Greenland. The film shootings had to be declared as scientific expeditions in order to get an entry permit to Greenland. Therefore, a few scientists were needed to accompany the film shootings, just to be there. The scientists were Löwe, Jewish scientist, he had to leave Germany later on, and Ernst Sorge, who had previously participated in the Wegener expedition. They claimed to have continued the scientific task of the Wegener expedition. I don't really know what they did. They haven't published any of their findings in a scientific journal. Well, without Knud Rasmussen's help, the expedition would not have taken place. Rasmussen, who visited Greenland in 1932 in order to prepare his own film shootings of his staged ethnographic documentary, Pallas Brulefeld, helped the film crew to get an entry permit to Greenland. The film expedition was officially conducted under the patronage or protectorate of Rasmussen. And furthermore, Rasmussen acted as an interpreter between the German film team and the Greenlandic cast. Well, after all, he was indispensable for the success of the Universal expedition. Well, due to the high number of participants, around 40 participants, the expedition resulted in 5 travel narratives and memoirs. Some are known, some are rather unknown. We have none of them in the library here in Nuuk, unfortunately. But among the travelogues, for example, is Leni Riefenstahl's travel book, which is interesting to read, let's say like this. Well, the travel reports of the Funk film expedition clearly reflect the shift of power in the year of 1933. In his travel account on the film expedition, the glaciologist, glaciologe Ernst Sorge, tells us about Leni Riefenstahl's enthusiasm for Hitler's Mein Kampf in the year of 1932. Ernst Sorge writes about Leni Riefenstahl, I cite, unfortunately it's my own translation. She used to have a small library on the expedition, including travelogues about journeys to the South Seas, because she was already planning the shooting of another film. However, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf was part of a basic repertoire of books. She read it with the utmost enthusiasm and agreed in her innermost conviction with the opinion expressed in the book. Her great admiration was expressed by the fact that she hung a picture of Adolf Hitler in a sealskin frame. Well, furthermore, Sorge gives thanks to the publishing house for making known the beauty of a country which had been the destination of Germanic seafaring already 1,000 years ago. Well, the Viking motif was incredibly popular among German polar researchers. They all depicted themselves as Vikings. Well, I've already mentioned the Second International Polar Year. It took place between November 1932 and November 1933. 44 nations participated in the Polar Year, and among the participants was a group of 4 German polar researchers. Interesting enough, already in 1932, the German participants brought the swastika flag to Greenland as a precaution. And according to decree of March 12, 1933, the black, red, gold flag of Germany had to be replaced by the swastika flag. This is a photograph of the research station. Well, it's not really a German expedition, but the collaboration on the universal feature film SOS Iceberg encouraged Knud Rasmussen to shoot his own Greenland movie. And his own film project was realized in the following summer of 1933 as part of the 7th Thule Expedition to East Greenland. The semi-documentary film was directed by the German Jewish film pioneer Friedrich Dalsheim, and furthermore the expedition was accompanied by German and Austrian mountain film cinematographers, among them Hans Scheib, Edi Wieser, Walter Traut. They don't need to be famous, they aren't. Rasmussen, who died on December 21st, 1933, was not able to see the premiere of his own film anymore in 1934. Dalsheim, the Jewish film director, on the other hand, took his own life in 1936 because of his work prohibition in Nazi Germany. The Austrian cinematographer, cameraman Edi Wieser, is the only participant actually known to have published a travelogue about the film Expedition to East Greenland. Wieser's travel book is notoriously racist against the Jewish film director Dalsheim. It's really disgusting if you read it. Well, and then there were a few cruises to Greenland, kind of proto-tourism, I would call it. In 1933, the Hudson's Bay Company decided to take tourists on board their supply ship Nescopy to the Arctic archipelago. Together with his son and wife, the Austrian travel journalist Colin Ross, he's a descendant of the British polar explorer John Ross, participated in the Nescopy's first cruise to the Arctic in the summer of 1933. The Nescopy started in Churchill, Canada, and set course for Robertson Bay in Thule. And already on Ellesmere Island, the most northern outpost of Canada, Ross encountered Greenlanders patrolling the Canadian border to Thule. The Greenlanders served a year on Ellesmere Island in the Canadian police. I saw it even in the archives here, that they were allowed, Knud Rasmussen allowed them to work for the Canadians a year. Well, the Nescopy took the Greenlanders on board and brought them to Thule. This is how Colin Ross came to Thule. He's a quite important figure of the 1930s. He was the second most successful author of the Brockhaus publishing house, after Sven Hedin. He published 19 books, published in 180 editions between 1922 and 1944. He was undoubtedly one of the most famous travel journalists of the Weimar Republic. About Joachim Gerstenberg's cruise is not much known. I don't have any information on that. He was on a supply trip to Thule and was allowed to participate as a photographer, as an artist. This is probably the most bizarre expedition of National Socialism, and there are many bizarre expeditions. Well, having already participated in the second International Polar Year in Greenland, Burckhardt led 2 expeditions to Iceland in 1934 and 1933 with the recommendation of the German Foreign Office and the SS think tank Ahnenerbe. The Ahnenerbe think tank was founded by Heinrich Himmler in 1935 and operated as an SS appendage until 1945, until the end. The Ahnenerbe think tank was devoted to the task of providing scientific evidence for the superiority of the Nordic Germanic race. The Ahnenerbe supported the idea that the modern Germans descended from the ancient Aryans an imaginary race. The research organization claimed that the Aryans had been responsible for most of the developments in human history, such as agriculture, art, writing, basically civilization. Burckhardt, who devoted his scientific work to the racial doctrines of Nazi Germany, offered his services for the Icelandic government too. The SS didn't know that. In Iceland, he collected objects for Berlin museums, that was his task, and shot a series of documentary movies commissioned by the Icelandic government. During his trip to Iceland, he borrowed money from Icelandic banks for his film shootings on behalf of the SS. He said the SS will pay. Burckhardt was not authorized by the SS to take out loans from banks, and even turned out that he had hidden his enormous debts from the SS. In 1936, the Ahnenerbe Institute initiated preparations for a wintering expedition to South Greenland. Himmler, chairman of the think tank, chose Burckhardt to lead the expedition, which was to take place from May 1937 till May 1938. Burckhardt was commissioned by the Ahnenerbe to prove the rather grotesque world ice theory, Welteislehre. If you've heard of it, it's weird. And he was commissioned to carry out archaeological excavations in Norse settlements. It should be noted that Burckhardt was a teacher for photography. He was neither an expert in astronomy nor in archaeology. Burckhardt also acted as a businessman during his preparations for the Greenland expedition. He sent a request to the concentration camp in Dachau. In order to save costs, political prisoners were supposed to timber the wooden boards for the German research station in Greenland. Since the concentration camp was booked up with orders, the request was denied. As soon as Himmler was informed about Burckhardt's debts in Iceland, the Ahnenerbe think tank withdrew fully its financial fundings, and Himmler dismissed Burckhardt from the SS while being in Greenland. Consequently, the wintering expedition was shortened to 16 weeks only, and Burckhardt ran up even more debts while being in Greenland on his own. Burckhardt, who claims to have made his living with public lectures on Iceland and Greenland, was not allowed to give any further public lectures, as he was believed to damage the reputation of the SS. That's his writer's ID. I found it in an antiquariat. I skipped that and finish with Herdemerten. The Herdemerten expedition of the Hermann Göring Foundation in the summer of 1938 was the last German Greenland expedition that has taken place before the war. On behalf of the Reichsjägerminister, Minister of Hunting Affairs, Hermann Göring, the task of the expedition was to bring polar falcons to Germany. Göring's hobbies were birds and falconry, and he wanted to have some Greenlandic birds. It's a true story. It's known that Herdemerten's expedition brought 5 falcons back to Germany. The expedition was led not by an ornithologist, an expert in birds, but by a mining engineer, Kurt Herdemerten. Well, yeah. In the following, I will discuss the stereotyped representations of the Greenlanders in National Socialist travel literature. And I would like to start with this theory about the cradle of the human race at the North Pole. To understand this bizarre theory, you just need 3 pictures: an apple, a map that pretends that there were land bridges, and a polar-centered map. This will explain everything. Well, the belief that humanity originated in the North Polar region is based on an old idea called the contracting Earth hypothesis and the global cooling theory, which were first stated in 1830 by a French geologist, I can't pronounce his name, Ilisimatusarfik. He suggests that the Earth was a hot and glowing celestial body, just like a hot and liquid iron ball cooling down over time. And the hypothesis states that features such as mountains formed as the Earth cooled down. And this is also why land bridges sank between the continents. Yeah, usually the wrinkles that form on a drying apple are used as an analogy for the formation of mountains on Earth, and as a result of the contraction, land bridges between the countries were believed to have sunken into the oceans. This was before the continental drift theory was known. The contraction hypothesis was replaced by the hypothesis of continental drift in the course of the first half of the 20th century. In the course of the 19th century, the contracting Earth hypothesis made its way into zoology, coming closer to human race. After the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species and his Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, the hypothesis of global cooling had added fuel to the debate over the geographical origins of the human species. In his 1865 essay, The North Pole, a Zoo-Geographical Center of Dispersion, the zoologist Gustav Jäger drew on the theories on geophysical global cooling. Jäger suggests that aquatic life first entered land on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, since it cooled down first. As the climate on the northern shores became colder over time, the Arctic flora and fauna had spread circularly in the direction of the equator. He states that former land bridges had connected the North Pole with Europe and America. Islands such as Iceland, Faroe Islands, Jan Mayen and the like were believed to be remnants of the sunken land bridges. And in 1865, Jäger says, if the presumed land connection between Europe and America could be proved, the origin and dispersion of mankind could be explained in a plausible way. Believe it or not, Jäger's hypothesis on the origin of mankind was soon taken up by a lot of natural scientists around the late 19th century. And the North Pole theory of the origin of mankind soon entered the discourse on Indo-European languages. In the mid-19th century, racial theorists, among them Arthur de Gobineau, equated the original speakers of the Indo-European language with an imaginary Indo-European or Aryan race. Aryanism was derived from the idea that the original speakers of the Indo-European languages constituted a distinctive and superior race, which was the only that could create culture, means civilization. By the 1880s, linguists, archaeologists, anthropologists argued that the Aryan themselves had originated somewhere in northern Europe. It was called Panker who coined the term Nordic race first in 1883. The Austrian philologist suggests Scandinavia to be the cradle of the Aryan race, which he equates with the term Nordic race. Nordicists claim that the Nordic race was the most superior branch of the Aryan race. Panker considers the Germanic people and thus the modern Germans as direct and pure descendants of the Nordic race, descending from Scandinavia. Well, among Nordicists, the polar region was soon considered the origin or the cradle of the Indo-European or Aryan people. Racial theorists referred to alleged archaeological finds and found further evidence in mythological sources, such as the Edda, Greek, and Indian mythology, that man has originated on the North Pole. The author Ludwig Wilzer was the first one to argue for the origin of the Aryan race at the North Pole. In his book Die Germanen, the Germanics, Wilzer argues that the Earth had, we know the theory, cooled down at the poles first. Because of the cooling process, the Earth must have gotten its first liquid water in the polar regions, logic, in which life could have developed. The transition from marine to terrestrial life had finally taken place on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. Wilzer considers the Greenland ice sheet as the last remnant of the glacial period in which we still live today. Previous to the Ice Age, the former continent Arctogaea, Polaris, Atlantis, Hyperborea, there were many names for the sunken continent or North Pole, had been connected with Scandinavia and North America by suggested land bridge by way of Arctic islands. We know them, such as Iceland and Greenland. Wilzer assumes that mankind had also originated in the Arctic. During the cooling of the northern hemisphere, it's getting colder, the Aryan race was forced to leave the North Pole southwards. He believed North Greenland to be the center of dispersion of the Aryan race. Among Nordicists, the climate conditions of the glacial period were believed to have had a positive impact on the evolutionary progress of the Arctic Aryans. The sooner groups of branches of the Aryan race had left the Arctic, the lower logic ranked in the racial hierarchy. Well, the North Pole theory became increasingly popular among Nordicists, occultists, esoterics. I could list you a lot of authors. I will not do it. But it's important to mention that this theory was really accepted among natural scientists and race theories. Good, we know the Germans considered themselves an Ice Age race, at least far right-wing and occultists and esoterics. We also know that the Greenlanders were considered an Ice Age race or Stone Age race. At the turn of the 20th century, anthropologists equated the Inuit culture with the European Stone and Ice Age culture. Some physical anthropologists went even further and compared the physical characteristics of the Inuit with Neanderthals, like Birkelsmith, we know that. But I will skip a bit. For anthropologists, Eskimologists, the Greenlander represented not only the timely but the primitive other from another age. Environmental determinism convinced many anthropologists that the Inuit were confined to a lower cultural development through the rigors of their environment, which focused all the energies of the Inuit on pure survival. The struggle for existence retarded further cultural progress for the Inuit. German literature, however, is largely free from such derogatory, condescending reflections on the Inuit. While Darwin considered extreme climates and the lack of natural resources to be detrimental to evolutionary progress, German race theorists regarded the cold climate as a key premise for the allegedly racial superiority. The extent to which the self-image of an ice-aged race for Germans has a positive effect on how German expeditioners perceive the Greenlanders as an alter ego, I will show it in the following. Yes, it's going to be more bizarre. The abstruse theory on the origin of the Aryan race in the Arctic allowed for positive identification with the Greenlanders. The National Socialist research organization Ahnenerbe dealt with the origin and heritage of the so-called Nordic race. Hermann Wirth, who was appointed by Heinrich Himmler president of this SS think tank in 1935, traced the path of the Nordic race back to Greenland. He says, the Germans come from Greenland originally. He was the president of this think tank. Wirth considered a connection between Greenlandic Inuit and the Nordic race based on cultural and physical similarities. He believed the Inuit and the descendants of the Nordic race have originated in Greenland and mixed in Greenland in prehistoric times, no one knows when. Referring to Wegener's continental drift theory, that's on the map, Wirth argues that the North Pole has shifted from west to the northeast in the course of history, and he believed that the ancestors of the imaginary Nordic race has lived in the fertile landscapes of today's polar region. According to Wirth's theory, the icing of the north drifting tectonic plates had forced the pre-Nordic race to migrate southwards. Wirth recognizes the igloos as a Nordic cultural technique, which was adopted by the Inuit from the Nordic race. In Europe, Aryan Stone Age settlers from Greenland had simply transferred the igloo architecture to stone. Wirth believes that the archaic stone brick building was preserved, for example, just one example, in the Trulli of southern Italy. That's a photo of there, says. That's the evidence. Germans come from the North Pole. Not yet. In 1933, the Austrian travel journalist Colin Ross sailed on board the icebreaker Nascope on the Hudson Space Company ship to Thule, where he had encountered, he says, living fossils of a time long gone in Europe. Ross, the travel journalist, believes that the Inuit represented the culture of the former European Ice Age people. So did the Danes, but he says, in the eternal ice, only one form of life is possible as developed by the Eskimos. And our ancestors must have lived and thought the same way during the Ice Age as the modern Eskimos. And he says, referring to the global cooling theory, one day we will have to live like the Eskimos again. In his travel book, the Ice Age serves as a benchmark between Inuit and Europeans in terms of the past. Author Ross claims to have already become aware of similarities between the culture of the indigenous people of Australia and the European Stone Age people. He just can't imagine that his ancestors could have lived like the Australian Aborigines today, The Australian climate and the flora and fauna conflicts his fantasy about his Nordic origins. His positive attitude towards the cold does not allow for the identification with peoples from warmer climates. While eventually Ross, this book sold in 10,000s, reflects on the theory of the origin of humanity on the North Pole. He says, if it is true that the Earth was a gloomy gas ball which has cooled down over time, all life, and human life too, must have originated at the poles, as we know that the poles have cooled down first. However, as the polar region was covered by ice, it remained home to the Eskimos. Well, based on Wirth's theories, Ross imagines racial connections between Europeans and the Inuit. He considers the Inuit to be, he says, human beings of our own flesh and blood. Ross regards the physiological difference between the Inuit and European as insignificant. He says, they look different from us Europeans, but not so different, by the way. And they are tougher and more modest in their demands than we are, but that's all. Well, Ross has already indicated the possible superiority of the Greenlander over the modern man with respect to the Arctic climate. In the following, I will show that many Germans who looked at the Greenlanders saw what they missed in themselves, especially the expeditionist use of modern technology in the Arctic has sparked a sense of inferiority to the Inuit. According to a great deal of German researchers, the Inuit did not depend on modern technical equipment in order to survive in the hostile nature of Greenland. Polar explorers mostly believed that the mechanization, like the industrialization of everyday life, causes alienation from nature and the loss of, biological terms, resilience to nature. Anti-modernist travelers to Greenland warned their readers frequently that civilization would cause physical and cultural degeneration. Thus, the civilized culture was frequently perceived as softened, spoiled, or effeminate. Contrary to National Socialist racial doctrines, asserting the cultural and physical superiority of the Nordic race, the German polar researcher Paul Burkhardt questioned the physical superiority of the so-called civilized man over the man of nature. He perceives the Greenlanders as a hardened and tough people which had adapted to the harsh living conditions of the Arctic like no other people. In terms of physiological faculties, he regarded the Greenlanders as superior to the so-called civilized man. He says, isn't that the difference between us and the Greenlander? The Greenlander survives due to his strong will and his perfect adaptation to the condition of his polar home. Without the modern technique of his civilization, the civilized man is helplessly exposed to the dangers of nature. Well, depending on his technical equipment, Burkhardt considers the civilized man inferior to the Greenlander. After all, Paul Burkhardt tried to overcome the dichotomy of civilization and the state of nature by, it's getting a bit complicated, disconnecting the concept of culture from the concept of civilization, what the Nazis usually did not do. In other words, Burkhardt elevates the Greenlanders to the level of a Kulturvolk, a culture people, despite being a people with a close relation to nature, or Naturvolk. He says, having understood their souls, one is astonished of the high culture of the less civilized people. Culture is the imprint of values that give spiritual meaning to life and the willingness to make sacrifices. The goal of any culture is the noble man, because this goal can be achieved at any level of civilization, no matter if high or low. The Greenlander was able to gain culture despite his low civilization. The hierarchy between so-called Naturmennesker and civilized people was quite controversial regarding the Greenlanders anyway, not only in Germany. Among anthropologists, the Inuit usually took a rather high position on the imaginary evolutionary ladder due to the material culture and biological adaptation to the climate. We know that very well by Nansen, for example, who says that a superficial examination of certain details in the outward life of the Eskimo might easily lead to the erroneous conclusion that he stands at the low grade of civilization, or Kulturtrin. When we take the trouble to look a little more closely at him, we soon see him in another light. However, according to the Nazi doctrine, the Nordic or Aryan race was considered superior to other races, to all other races, due to the struggle of life during Ice Age. Therefore, Nordicists declared the faculty of cultural creativeness a unique feature of the Nordic or Aryan race. Acknowledging culture to an indigenous people severely affronted the official racial doctrines of Nazi Germany. And I don't know how many of you have read Hitler's Mein Kampf, but he talks about the Eskimo. Hitler says the Eskimos can't have any culture. This is not possible. He says this primordial creative faculty in cultural things was not solely due to the northern climate. For the Laplanders or the Eskimos would not have become creators of a culture if they were transplanted to the south. No, this wonderful creative faculty is a special gift bestowed on the Aryan. Well, Hitler's close confidant, Colin Ross, questions the superiority of the white race over the Inuit too. With respect to the anti-modernist discourse of the 1930s, Ross suggests that all Germans should better learn from the Inuit culture. He says, as absurd as it may sound, we can only learn from the Eskimos for the necessary transformation of our own civilization and culture, he says that in 1933. These people of the frosty north are among the happiest people on earth. It's getting more exciting. As a model or blueprint for Germany, Ross refers to the autarky of the Inuit. He says, the most important thing the white man can learn from the Eskimo is his self-sufficiency. Ross labels the condition in which the Inuit live as a natural form of National Socialism. He calls the culture of them National Socialism. He idealizes the society of the Inuit as altruistic and free from social hierarchies and division of labor. But even that is not new. Well, this is what he says. Ross says the communism of the Eskimos, or rather their National Socialism, is based on the temporary deadly threat from a hostile nature and the need to protect against it. Each tribe and each group that lives and hunts together will, in the case of need and scarcity, share as much as they can. He read a lot of Nansen. Nansen saw in the communities of the Inuit a possible socialism carried out into practice. And he says the social reformers of today might learn much in these high latitudes. So it's typical National Socialist to protect the fantasy of National Socialism on this society, but in modernism it could also be communism, for example, or socialism. Well. The Übermensch lives in Greenland. Yes, the German expeditionists contrasted. No, I'm a bit too far, I'm sorry. Sorry. Well, the German expeditionists contrasted the Greenlanders with Christians. They did not see a heathen community that lives among Christian rules, Christian values like the missionaries did once upon a time. They saw the Antichrist society among them. In German travel literature, the Greenlander conveys critique to Christianity and represents a crisis of modernity too. Therefore, I will show to what extent the Greenlander resembles Nietzsche's figuration of the Übermensch. The Übermensch, or Overman, or Superman, is a concept in the philosophy of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He posited the Übermensch as a goal for humanity in his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Also sprach Zarathustra, published in 1883. However, Nietzsche never developed the concept on racial grounds. That's important to know. Instead, the Übermensch seems to be the ideal aim of spiritual development, more than a biological goal. Nazism, however, distorted the concept's real meaning in order to make it fit its master race view. The National Socialist reception of Nietzsche is based on the misguided interpretation of the Superman or Übermensch as a goal of humanity in a biological sense, mainly. In travel literature, the reader finds clear but implicit references, but they're kind of clear, to the book The Antichrist and the image of the anti-modern Hyperborean. Well, who's the Hyperborean? If the Greenlanders should be the Hyperborean, Hyperborea. In Greek mythology, the Hyperboreans were believed to live in the high north, beyond the Boreas, the north winds. And therefore, they were thought to not be hit by the icy winds of the north. The Hyperboreans lived happily in a mild, fertile, and sunny land, according to Greek mythology. It was believed that Apollo, the ancient Greek god of light, spent his winters amongst the Hyperboreans. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche uses the term Hyperborea as a figure of identification in order to emphasize his own status beyond modern society and to express his own hermitage. The first paragraph of The Antichrist constitutes a kind of polemic preface against modernity. Well, he turns the first chapter in the book Antichrist to the readers and says, "Let us look each other in the face. We are Hyperboreans. We know well enough how remote our place is. Rather live amid the ice than among modern virtues and other such south winds." Well, it is unclear in which line Nietzsche changes his role from the Hyperborea to the Antichrist, that's the devil. However, Nietzsche switches roles and presents the catechism or virtues of the Antichrist. In the Antichrist, Nietzsche asserts that Christianity, not merely as a religion, but also as the predominant moral system of the Western world, inverts nature and is hostile to life. This is going to be interesting when we will look to the Greenlander. Well, Nietzsche says Christianity is called the religion of pity. Pity stands in opposition to all the tonic passions that augment the energy of the feeling of aliveness. Pity is a depressant. A man loses power when he pities. Through pity that rain upon strength which suffering works is multiplied 1,000-fold. Suffering is made contagious by pity. Pity thwarts the whole law of evolution, which is the law of natural selection. It preserves whatever is ripe for destruction. It fights on the side of those disinherited and condemned by life. By maintaining life in so many of the budget of all kinds, it gives life itself a gloomy and dubious aspect. Well, interpretation, Nietzsche makes explicit references to social Darwinism and eugenics, or racial hygiene. Eugenics was a movement that was aimed at improving the genetic composition of the human race by either artificial selection or by eliminating or sterilizing those whose genes were considered imperfect, or in a racial sense, impure. Social Darwinism, in turn, was a popular theory in the late 19th century that claims that life for humans in society was ruled by survival of the fittest. At its core, eugenics and social Darwinism conflict the Christian understanding that all human beings are created in God's image and thus have value, worth, and dignity. Well, in the 1930s travel books, the Greenlanders were not only imagined as a heathen pagan people, but as an anti-Christian people that lived according to natural laws, and such as natural selection. The Greenlanders' morality derived from natural laws was considered inconsistent with Christian moralities. So in some kind, the Greenlander was the Antichrist. The German travel writing thus presents a distorted model of the virtuous pagan, in Germany would say tugendhafte Heide, which is consistent with Nietzsche's Nazified version of the anti-modern and anti-Christian Übermensch. A prime example for the figuration of the Antichrist, or Hyperborea, can be found in Burckhardt's travel book, White Struggle. In his travelogue, Burckhardt opposes morals of Christianity such as mercy and sorrow. According to the Polar researcher, who was actually just a photograph, the life-affirming man of nature cannot afford pity and grief, since life was already hard enough in Greenland, meaning that pity would weaken the strong individuals among the Inuit. He says, a people whose homeland imposes such harsh living conditions on them cannot afford feelings such as mercy and sadness. Only the colonization has familiarized the Greenlanders with our Christian moral concepts. Thus the terms pity and grief in this country remained alien. Mourning over what? Life may be hard but beautiful. I'm happy because I feel strong. Dead tomorrow? Why not? Once we will be all dead. Well, a lot of pathos. The image of the Greenlander, it was the image of the Greenlander that coincides with the popular image of Greenland as a harsh and tough country. In other words, the nature of Greenland is metaphorically transferred onto the Greenlanders. Ernst Sorge, a German glaciologist, not a philosopher, and former companion of Alfred Wegener, presents such a heroic and masculine image of the man of nature. We will also see there's social Darwinism, natural selection. He says, he travels to Greenland and writes to his readers, anyone who traveled to Greenland was inspired by the feeling that money makes not the rules there, but the human capacity only. It would be a healthy cure for some people to strengthen their corrupted lifestyle in the north. Some people would perish, some would become happier. Sorge contrasts the heroic life in nature with the corrupted lifestyles of modern societies, even though he's not very precise about what he's complaining. In evolutionary terms, Sorge addresses the consequences of natural selection. The glaciologist depicts eugenics and natural hygiene as laws given by nature. Well, we can assume that natural selection, according to Ernst Sorge, has already eliminated the weakest individuals of the Arctic people, the Inuit. We read lines like the following. The Arctic man must fight or die. Loneliness makes man thoughtful. Suffering sharpens his insight. Suffering strengthens his will to victory. Suffering incites him to manhood. Of course, it's always manhood. Well, the will to victory was a National Socialist slogan coined by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, by the way. And according to Sorge, those who underlie the struggle of life in the Arctic are doomed to succumb to the evolutionary pressure of selection without the right to expect mercy. Well, the German authors clearly projected an implicit version of themselves and their society onto the Greenlander. The Arctic men were credited with National Socialist virtues and were admired for the success in the struggle for existence and adaptability. Given the shared presumption of German racial superiority, the given positive image of the Greenlander is more than striking. There are hardly any exceptions. However, the Greenlander represented the harsh nature of the Arctic North. He presented the anti-modern and anti-Christian, and the society was believed to be free from social hierarchy and division of labor. Therefore, the image of the Greenlander represented the ideal of a National Socialist society. It was even called like that. That's all from me tonight. Thank you.